Summer, 1940. France collapses in just 6 weeks. The proud French army, once thought invincible, is swept aside by Hitler's blitzkrieg. Paris, the city of light, is smothered under the iron grip of German boots. Families flee in terror, soldiers surrender in disgrace, and the tricolor flag is replaced by the swastika. But while the nation drowns in humiliation, something even more sinister begins to spread. France becomes more than just a battlefield, it becomes a marketplace. A place where survival, betrayal, and greed are traded as ruthlessly as bullets and bread. The Nazis strip the country bare, looting paintings, gold, and jewels. Priceless treasures vanish from banks, galleries, and private homes, swallowed into the black hole of the German war machine. And into this chaos steps a man who would become one of the most infamous profiteers of the war. His name was Mandel Szkolnikoff, a man whose story is not one of courage, but of cunning. While millions suffered under starvation, repression, and deportation, he carved out an empire of unimaginable wealth. How? By playing both sides. By clothing German soldiers while smuggling art and jewels under the noses of the Gestapo. By feasting in Parisian mansions while other Jews were herded into cattle cars. Protected by high-ranking Nazis, Szkolnikoff transformed from an obscure Jewish merchant into one of the richest men in occupied France. Think about the madness of it. While ordinary Parisians stood in line for a crust of bread, Szkolnikoff dined on silver platters. While resistance fighters were hunted and executed, he was buying luxury hotels on the Riviera. And as millions of Jews across Europe were exterminated in Auschwitz and Treblinka, he was living in mansions guarded by the very killers carrying out that genocide. This isn't just the story of one man. It's the story of how war turns morality upside down. When nations collapse, when laws disappear, when fear suffocates hope, monsters rise, not always with guns, but with contracts, ledgers, and silk ties. Mandel Szkolnikoff was one such monster. And in this video, you'll learn how a man who should have been a victim became a king in the empire of thieves. How he rose from nothing to control Parisian streets, Monaco's hotels, and millions in Nazi gold. And finally, how his empire collapsed in blood, betrayal, and mystery. Before we dive deeper, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep uncovering the hidden, darker sides of history that textbooks refuse to teach. And trust me, you do not want to miss what comes next. Because this isn't just history, it's a warning. To understand how Mandel Szkolnikoff became the richest man in Nazi-occupied France, we must look back to his origins, a story of constant reinvention, fraud, and escape. He was born in 1895, in a small town in present-day Belarus. A place where life was precarious, where Jews lived between the cracks of empires. His family was comfortable, his father a textile trader, and young Mandel learned early how to move fabric, count coins, and survive on quick deals. But from the beginning, he was more than a merchant. He was a hustler. As a teenager, he supplied cloth to the Imperial Russian army. When the Bolsheviks took power, he switched sides without hesitation and sold to the Red Army. But opportunists rarely last long under revolutionary governments, and soon Szkolnikoff fled, first to Poland, then to Belgium, then to France. Each time, he left behind creditors, convictions, and scandal. Fraud, bankruptcy, illegal banking, even pretending to be a doctor. He was a man of many crimes, but also many masks. When he arrived in France in the early 1930s, he knew survival meant disguise. So Mandel became Michel. He softened his Jewish identity, styled himself as a respectable businessman, and opened a fabric company with his brother. By day, he was a dealer in surplus cloth. By night, whispers followed him, stolen art, jewels, shady loans. He drove around Paris in an American luxury car, dressed sharply, and cultivated an image of wealth that concealed a trail of lies. French police tried to expel him in 1937 after yet another fraud conviction. But as a stateless Jew, where could he be sent? The system couldn't get rid of him, and so Michel stayed, waiting, watching, ready. Then came the war. As the German tanks rolled into Paris in 1940, millions saw only disaster. But Michel Szkolnikoff saw the opportunity of a lifetime. With uncanny timing, he positioned himself as a supplier to the German Kriegsmarine, the Navy. The Nazis needed cloth for uniforms, boots, and tarps. Szkolnikoff provided them, not just fulfilling orders but exploiting shortages, bribing officials, and cutting deals in the shadows. He worked with German buyers who themselves skimmed profits from the system. It was corruption feeding corruption. But Szkolnikoff's real genius wasn't just making money. It was protection. He embedded himself so deeply with German officers that he became untouchable. French police who once hunted him now looked the other way. Courts that once tried to expel him ignored his existence. He was no longer just a shady merchant. He was a man under Nazi protection, a collaborator whose frauds fueled an empire. From these early years of the occupation, his fortune began to snowball. What started as uniforms and fabrics would soon expand into stolen art, black market luxury goods, and eventually, entire hotels. Mandel Szkolnikoff, Michel, as he now preferred, was no longer merely a survivor. He was becoming the shadow king of occupied France. By 1942, the war had entered its darkest phase. Across Europe, Jews were being deported in mass transports to Auschwitz and Treblinka. Paris lived under hunger, curfews, and fear. But for Michel Szkolnikoff, business had never been better. Through his mistress, a German woman named Helene, Szkolnikoff gained access to the very heart of Nazi power. She introduced him to Fritz Engelke, an SS officer who had once served Heinrich Himmler himself. Engelke became more than just a contact. He became Szkolnikoff's shield. With the SS at his back, the Jewish merchant who should have been hunted was instead protected, empowered, and unleashed. The system was simple, and it was grotesque. Szkolnikoff bought goods cheap, sometimes knowing they were about to be confiscated from their rightful owners, and then resold them to the SS for staggering profits. Uniforms, tarpaulins, stockings, leather, perfumes, jewelry. Every shortage was an opportunity, every confiscation a deal. At his peak, Szkolnikoff earned 1 to 2 million francs per month. His fortune grew to the modern equivalent of $500 million. But money alone wasn't enough. He wanted permanence, legacy, power beyond the war. So he turned to real estate. Through a spiderweb of companies, he began acquiring hotels, villas, and entire city blocks. In Monaco, he bought so many properties that the government was forced to change its laws. In Paris, he swallowed up buildings along the Champs-Élysées, buying at prices no one else could match. His holdings included luxury hotels, the Plaza in Nice, the Grand Hotel de Paris, the Windsor in Monaco. Palaces of glass and marble that once symbolized France's elegance were now owned by a collaborator who thrived on its ruin. By 1944, Szkolnikoff had become the single largest property owner in Monaco. And with wealth came indulgence. At 19 Rue de Presbourg, just steps from the Arc de Triomphe, he lived with Helene in decadent splendor. 10 servants tended to their home. Weekends were spent in villas, country chateaux, or on the Riviera. Their dinners became legend. German officers, businessmen, Belgian suppliers, all seated at a table dripping with silver and crystal. Whispers even claimed that Himmler himself once dined there, escorted by Engelke. This was the obscene heart of occupation. While ordinary Parisians lined up for hours to buy a few potatoes, Szkolnikoff's kitchens served feasts. While resistance fighters were tortured in cellars, Szkolnikoff's guests toasted champagne under crystal chandeliers. He had transformed himself into something more than a profiteer. He was a prince of corruption, a man whose empire was built not with tanks or guns, but with contracts, bribes, and shameless greed. But empires built in darkness rarely last. And as the tide of war turned against Germany, Szkolnikoff's glittering world of hotels, jewels, and Nazi protection began to crumble. By 1944, the tide of war had shifted. The Allies landed in Normandy. German defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. For Szkolnikoff, the man who had built a fortune under occupation, it was time to secure an escape. He turned his gaze south, to Franco's Spain, a neutral country where Nazi collaborators hoped to hide their wealth. Carrying gold and jewelry worth millions, Szkolnikoff crossed the border and began moving his assets into Spanish banks. But even in exile, his greed betrayed him. Spanish intelligence quickly grew suspicious. In May 1944, he was arrested carrying jewels valued at 800 million francs. Once again, the SS intervened, and once again he was freed. But by the time France was liberated in August, he was trapped. He could not return to Paris, where his name was already synonymous with betrayal. He could not leave Spain, where officials kept him under watch. For the first time in years, Szkolnikoff was vulnerable. The new French provisional government knew what he had done. He wasn't just a profiteer, he had become the richest man in France by feeding off its misery. His properties, his companies, his fortune, it all had to be recovered. A covert team of French agents was assembled. Their mission: capture Szkolnikoff, drag him back across the border, and force him to pay for his crimes. On June 10, 1945, the trap was sprung. In Madrid, agents lured Szkolnikoff with the promise of a jewelry deal. When he arrived, he resisted capture. Sedatives were forced into him, and he was stuffed into the trunk of a car headed toward France. But somewhere on that road, the story ended. What happened next is shrouded in mystery. Some accounts say he overdosed on the drugs and died before reaching the border. Others claim he fought back and was beaten so severely that he suffered a fractured skull and died of a heart attack. Whatever the truth, his body was dumped beneath a bridge near the village of El Molar, north of Madrid, doused in petrol, and set alight. There was no trial, no confession, just a corpse in the dust of Spain, and a fortune scattered across Europe. What followed was extraordinary. The French state seized his empire: hotels, villas, apartments, and businesses. More than 50 buildings in Paris alone. It was, and still remains, the largest asset seizure in French history. And so the story of Mandel Szkolnikoff ends as it began, in shadows. He lived as a fraud, thrived as a collaborator, and died as a fugitive. His name is a reminder that in times of war, greed can be as destructive as any bomb, and betrayal can enrich a man more than loyalty ever could.